Welcome into another episode of Locked On Phillies. And in today's episode, Taijuan Walker has seen a velocity increase in spring training. What does it mean for his chances to make this Philadelphia Phillies team?
You are Locked On Phillies, your daily Philadelphia Phillies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, this is Locked On Phillies. I'm your host, Connor Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us today. We come to you as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You may know me from some of my other work in the sports talk space. I've been on air over at 97.5 The Fanatic doing Philly Sports Talk Radio for 5 years. I've been a credentialed Philadelphia Phillies media member for 3 seasons, and this is my 4th year as the host of Locked On Phillies. Please make sure that you're rating and reviewing if you're listening to this in podcast form. We're available wherever you get your podcasts. We're also available on YouTube if you want to watch us in video. It's a great way to consume Locked On Phillies, and also make sure you subscribe if you're doing that. Go to Locked On Phillies channel, hit that subscribe button. You get notifications when new episodes are posted so you don't miss any of the big news surrounding the Phillies. It's also a great way to help me out here on Locked On Phillies. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. So, got a fun episode for you today. We're going to answer some Mailbag Monday questions in the second segment. But the first place that we're going to start is a conversation about Taijuan Walker, who's seen a nice increase in velocity over last year when we look at his spring numbers. And then we're going to round out with something fun that happened between Trea and Max Scherzer. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll explain what it was and why baseball is just absolutely the best. It's just such a fun sport. But let's start with Taijuan Walker, because this is probably the most germane topic to what is going on with the team in spring training for today's episode. So Walker is in a really interesting spot. Just to reset the situation of where Taijuan Walker finds himself with the Philadelphia Phillies. He signs a lucrative contract 2 off seasons ago, comes in to be the back-end starter of the Philadelphia Phillies rotation, and he goes out and he wins 15 games, but they were more of like those empty wins. Like, oh, okay, he gave up 6, but the team scored 8 and stuff like that. And he wasn't bad, but he wasn't as good as those numbers would indicate. And then in the postseason, he doesn't pitch at all. They go with Cristopher Sanchez for an innings worth of a spot start over him pitching at all in 3 series worth, I should say. So you look at that and you say, oh, all right. Man, that's kind of interesting that he didn't throw. He wasn't happy with it. Rob Thompson had to address it after because he made some comments on social media, not Rob Thompson, Taijuan Walker. And that kind of started feeling a little bit fishy. Like, people were like, why is Taijuan Walker complaining? And also, it was a loss to the Arizona Diamondbacks, so everyone was already on edge. Then last year, he has one of the worst pitching performances I've seen in a Philadelphia Phillies uniform from a guy who actually should be a major league caliber pitcher in a long time. He was awful last year. And the problem is the contract makes him very, very difficult to move, especially where it was last year. Now, as you get deeper in, he has this year and then next year still on the deal. So as you get deeper into the contract that he signed, it'll be easier to move. But last year, no one was trading for him. So you just kind of had to live with that, and he stunk, and he went on the IL. I'll do finger quotes for the IL because it seemed like one of those, this guy stinks and we can't cut him and pay all this money or anything. He doesn't have minor league options, so he's hurt. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It was a nightmare season for Taijuan Walker in 2024. So now, heading into 2025, the Phillies acquire Jesus Luzardo. They have 5 top-of-the-line starters, right? Zach Wheeler, Aaron Nola, Ranger Suarez, Cristopher Sanchez, Jesus Luzardo. We're going to get into a conversation a little bit later on in the week about those guys and how special this rotation could be. But, yeah, so Taijuan Walker's on the outside looking in, and you might say, well, you need depth. Andrew Painter is going to be your number 1 depth option. He's your top pitching prospect, and he's going to be ready mid-summer of this year. So Walker's on the outside looking in. He's obviously a guy that the Phillies want to move on from. But in order to trade him with that level of contract, the Phillies are going to have to, 1, eat a lot of salary, and 2, prove that he can actually pitch. Like, no one's just taking scrap heap guys, except for maybe the Miami Marlins, because the Marlins have this weird thing where they have to reach a salary floor. You have to have a certain payroll level. There is no cap, but there is a floor so that cheap owners are not just not paying players. So they may have to go get a guy that has a big contract that a team's willing to move on from, that's a bad contract, just to set up their salary situation to make sure that they're paying enough money by the standards set by the MLB, PA, and the league. So we'll see. But short of that, if there's other teams that are like, we are somewhat interested in Taijuan Walker, you know what their follow-up is? We got to see the guy pitch. He sucked last year, all due respect. And Taijuan Walker has come out this spring and made things interesting, because what I think a lot of people were expecting is Taijuan Walker comes out this spring. His velocity is still 91. That doesn't really set up the sinker that he's been known for his career very well, because you got to have velo to create the opportunity to throw that. We talked about how that works with Christopher Sanchez throwing harder. His changeup could get better. Well, with Taijuan Walker throwing slower over the past couple of years, the sinker has been a non-factor. And he's come out and thrown like 94. And that is a really, really encouraging sign for a couple reasons. The question is, well, how does that end up playing out for Taijuan Walker? Because he has given up some hard contact in his opportunities to pitch in the spring, but throwing 94 is, like I said it with Jordan Romano, the number one indicator of health for a pitcher is their velocity at any given time. When you see a dip in velocity, normally an injury follows. When you see an increase in velocity from that time a guy was dealing with stuff or not pitching at his best, well, that's a good sign that the guy's getting back healthy. And Taijuan Walker seems to be healthy. He seems to be motivated. Now, this brings us to the question, what's the best case scenario for the Phillies? Is it that they trade Taijuan Walker? Is it that they keep Taijuan Walker and he becomes, remember, the Philadelphia Phillies have an open spot in their bullpen. Now, do you stash Taijuan Walker there because you can't send it to the minors unless he agrees to it, which could be an opportunity where he does say yes because he wants to stay with this organization and knows that injuries happen all the time and he'd rather get a chance with a winning organization than otherwise. Like, I'm sure he'd rather be in Philadelphia than with the Miami Marlins. If he was not pitching in Philly or pitching in Miami, I think he'd still pick the not pitching in Philly, just because that organization's a dumpster fire and you have a chance to win a World Series here. And if somebody goes down, who knows what your opportunities are going to be. So that's basically where the Phillies are at. They have a now interesting decision. Is it, let's stick with our plan. We're going to try and convince the team to trade for him. If we can get that done, we'll eat some of the salary. We'll get him off the books. We'll clear cap space. We'll open up our ability to do more this next offseason or at the trade deadline potentially. And we'll finally be rid of that contract because we don't need another starter. Or is it, wow, we wanted you to intrigue other teams, but you've actually intrigued us. So how do we look at keeping you as a depth option so that if we have another Ranger Suarez injury season, we have more than one guy available who's just a young player who's never pitched at the major league level coming off Tommy John surgery, and Andrew Painter. Now, I would a billion times out of a billion, not even think twice, rather have Andrew Painter on this baseball team than Taijuan Walker. But Andrew Painter's not a sure thing, and he's certainly not a sure thing when it comes to health. So maybe Taijuan Walker is a guy that they like for depth. But I'll tell you right now, I don't see a path to Taijuan Walker being on this baseball team. He's not going to be on the team, in my opinion. I just don't think there's enough he can do. The best he can do is intrigue other teams into trading for him, but I don't see any way that they put him in that final bullpen spot. I don't see any way that he agrees to go to the minors. Like, I don't see it at all for Taijuan Walker to be a part of the 26-man opening day roster. Now, we're going to do our new roster projection tomorrow. Maybe my thoughts will change between now and then. I'd be surprised if they did. There would have to be some hell of a story come out or something like that from spring training to say, oh, Taijuan Walker, the Phillies really like keeping him. But even if they do that, it's a smokescreen for him potentially to be traded, right? I got asked the question this morning that was very interesting from my guy, Andrew Salchunas, who is part of the morning show, Kincaid and Salchunas on 97.5 The Fanatic that I produce. And he asked me, is some team going to fall for him? Is some team going to fall for Taijuan Walker's increase in velocity and make that trade? And my answer was no. And they're going to trade for him anyway. Like, there's not necessarily a falling for something here that I think is going to happen. I don't think people are going to look at this increase in velocity and be like, well, we're going to get something out of Taijuan Walker. But I do think there are just enough bad teams around baseball whose rotations need more MLB-ready pieces that if you get a healthy Taijuan Walker, even if it's a bad Taijuan Walker, he's a guy that is he's a major league athlete, right? When he's healthy, Taijuan Walker is a major league pitcher. Now, is he a 5 or a 4 on a bad team? That's probably where he's at right now in his career. But he's not a AAA guy, right? As much as he had an awful season last year, I do think injuries played part of that. And there are teams out there that would love to have Taijuan Walker to just give their fan base the false sense of they're competing, even though it won't because baseball fans are smarter than that. But I don't think anyone's looking at Taijuan Walker and saying, wow, the Phillies are going to make a mistake if they try and trade him and we're going to be first in line. But I also don't think that means the market doesn't exist for him. I think just the market for Taijuan Walker is bad teams that need major league caliber guys because they don't have enough of them because their owners are cheap or whatever. And if their owners are cheap, well, the Phillies will have to eat some money in this situation anyway. But that's where the Taijuan Walker situation currently stands. He's throwing harder. He looks healthier. The production, it's spring training, whatever. I'm not going to overly look into it as far as how he's been pitching, just kind of the numbers behind the velocity look solid compared to last year. And I'm thinking still it's a pretty sure thing that the Phillies will look to move him before the start of spring or start of regular season. I don't think they keep him. I don't think there's any way they can. I don't think they have a roster spot for him. I don't think they use the bullpen spot for him. And I'm not looking at Taijuan Walker as a member of the 2025 Philadelphia Phillies. We will keep you updated on if that changes because we've still got 24 days to go till opening day. So things can change over the course of 3 weeks or so. We'll see, but don't fall for it yourself. I was talking about other teams falling for the Taijuan Walker increase in velocity. Phillies fans, I may not have to tell you because we were so annoyed with the guy last year. Don't fall for the increase in velocity yourself. Taijuan Walker is still Taijuan Walker, but maybe this gives you a better opportunity to move him. Coming up next, speaking of spring performances and what to buy and what not to buy. Well, we got a question in Mailbag Monday about spring worries, and I don't really have too many, but we will discuss what a listener was asking in our Mailbag Monday tweet coming up next as we continue today's episode of Locked On Phillies. But let's talk about FanDuel first, because when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started. And there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature. I mean, it's awesome to be able to jump in mid-game and take some action on something. Now, I did it yesterday on Wisconsin and Michigan State, and I didn't win. But it was fun to be able to do that because I showed up at a bar, and it was just a little bit after halftime, and I was like, I want action on this game. FanDuel's great handling that. So whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app's easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our Mailbag Monday questions, because we always get a great number of responses and focused responses from our Mailbag Monday tweets. Now, if you ever want to get your question in for Locked On Phillies, the way that you do it is we just post on Twitter, and it's at LO_Phillies. You can reply to this tweet with your Mailbag Monday questions. It's generally the gist of it. So we have a couple here, but the first one that I want to start with is a question from AJ. AJ, though, 410 on Twitter. And he asks, should we be concerned with the rough outings from the core players in the spring? Well, AJ, short answer, no, you should not be. It's spring training. It's way too early to worry about anything that the guys are doing. Now, do you want to see guys go down there and tear the cover off the ball and look like they're ready to roll? Absolutely. And I know he's talking about the hitters because the pitching staff has been phenomenal. But as far as like position players and like, oh, he's over whatever, he's struggling to do this, that, the other thing. One, these guys are working on stuff. Like Trea Turner's not trying to make the team. Kyle Schwarber and Bryce Harper are not trying to make the team. Like none of the guys that were on the Philadelphia Phillies last year are like, how do I make this team? Like Garrett Stubbs is probably the only dude returning from last year's roster that is like, oh man, I got to have a great spring. Like I got to go bat 300. Everybody else is just like, I don't care what I hit. I'm going to work on stuff. And we know the Philadelphia Phillies are a team offensively that has to work on stuff. They could be getting used to a new approach. They could be fixing hitches and swings. They could be going through that and saying, okay, I don't care if I bat 0-0-0 for spring training. Like if I feel more comfortable about my approach in the regular season as a result, that's the more important thing. So it just with a veteran team like the Philadelphia Phillies have, spring training performance doesn't matter at all. Like unless you're a guy that's somehow trying to make the roster like a Garrett Stubbs, you don't have to worry about spring training players' performances at all. And another thing you have to remember as well is, and I've said this before, but I'm sure people forget, people may not have watched episodes. I feel like every year I bring it up, but I don't bring it up often. So I'll just say again, when the season starts at any baseball level, whether it's D3 college baseball where I played or it's spring training for a major league team, pitching is always ahead of hitting. Hitting, reactionary. Reactions can fade. Pitching, you get to be the aggressor. You get to make the decision. You get to throw the pitch. You choose what you're throwing. You choose where you're throwing it. And by the way, that catcher back there is in the same spot he was last year. And that strike zone is in the same spot it was last year. And every year since you started playing the game of baseball. And that mound is still 60 feet, 6 inches away. And your arm is still attached to your body. And you can go out there and do what you need to do. The hitters, meanwhile, have not spent all offseason seeing major league pitching, right? You can face a not major league batter necessarily, but like you can throw major league pitches in the offseason much easier than you can get the opportunity to hit major league pitches. So pitchers are always ahead of hitters to start the season, always. And that includes spring training. So if you're overreacting to how the Philadelphia Phillies hitters are going, well, you have to give them a little bit of a bump because of the whole concept of baseball. Hey, pitchers always ready first. Hitters get ready second. Takes them a little bit more to get going. But with that in mind, when we have a conversation later this week about the Phillies pitching staff and what they've been doing, you got to give a little knock to the pitching staff saying, well, pitching's always ahead of hitting. It goes both ways. So I'll be fair in both aspects on that. But to answer AJ's question, no, you should not be concerned about the rough outings from the core players in the spring. The Philadelphia Phillies are still going to be a great baseball team. They're going to be just fine. You're going to be in a situation where this season is still a bunch of regular season wins. I know people don't care about regular season wins anymore. It's all about how you perform in the postseason. They're going to be fine. We also have a question here from Sean Fitzpatrick who says, give me the dark horse player who has caught your attention thus far in spring training, the player who is off your radar but might now land a roster spot. Now, this is tricky because I don't think there are any dark horse players for the Philadelphia Phillies. I don't think there's anybody who came out of nowhere. Anybody might be funny because could it be Buddy Kennedy? I don't know if I can count Buddy Kennedy as a dark horse candidate, but with the Weston Wilson injury, he has a much better opportunity to make the team. I don't know. The Phillies are just so stacked as far as we have veteran players. We have guys that have been on this team. We brought everybody back. We don't have a lot of holes. Relief pitchers are always a crapshoot, so I'm still trying to figure out exactly who that could be. I could say Taijuan Walker, but I don't believe the Phillies would do that. I don't think they would keep him in a bullpen spot or as an extra starter. Like that seems to be a traumatic last-ditch effort to get something out of him that would really turn off the fan base. Like, could you imagine the reaction if the Phillies went out? And I know we talked about it earlier on in our first segment, but if Taijuan Walker was on this team opening day after everything this fan base has felt about him for the past year and a half, like we'd lose our minds. I'd lose my mind. This would be like Garrett Stubbs making the roster times 1 billion. And I don't understand how it could happen. As far as guys that I like that have had a nice spring, I like what Gabriel Rincones has been doing. Um, I really like his swing. I like his ability to create a little bit of pop. I don't know what his future is with this organization. A lot of that is going to be determined by, well, what happens as far as these veteran players that are dropping off, guys like JT Realmuto, Nick Castellanos, Kyle Schwarber, if they re-sign them, or if you're looking for more internal promotion, maybe he's like the next Weston Wilson, Cody Clemens guy, where if somebody goes down or a couple guys go down, you elevate him and you give him a chance and see if he works. But he's had a really, really nice start to his spring. I don't think there's any way for him to make the roster. Like, I don't see that as a realistic possibility. But could he play for the major league team at some point this season? He's probably a guy to keep an eye on. And just in case that you could see a quick bump due to any potential injuries for the Philadelphia Phillies at a weak spot of the roster. So hopefully that answers your question, but it's a tough one to really break down just because the Phillies have so much stuff set. You'll realize that again when we do our version 2 of our opening day roster predictions coming up in tomorrow's episode. But coming up to end today's episode, baseball is so much fun. I love it because there's a lot of downtime, right? At least the funny moments, either in the booth or in the dugout or in the outfield or in the stands. And sometimes, rarely, you only ever see this in spring training or the All-Star game, between the pitcher and the hitter. And the guy who was smiling this time, oof, yeah, you'll never believe it. Max Scherzer. I don't think I've seen it in his career. We'll tell you why he was smiling and what Trea Turner had to do with it as we wrap up today's episode. So there are levels to this that you have to explain the situation that occurred when the Philadelphia Phillies took on the Toronto Blue Jays. Remember, this may be like a wait, what? Max Scherzer is now a member of the Toronto Blue Jays. In case you missed it, he's on Toronto, so you're going to have to keep an eye on that if you love aging Hall of Fame lock pitchers who don't have a lot left in the tank. But Max Scherzer is like one of the greats of this era when it comes to pitching. We had a conversation in free agency. Do the Phillies look at Max Scherzer? But obviously, Scherzer starts his career with the Tigers, and then he ends up going to the Washington Nationals, where he wins a World Series as part of that team and one of the main leaders of that team. And there was a young up-and-coming player on that team by the name of Trea Turner, who was also part of that World Series winning team before he heads to the Dodgers and then signs with the Phillies in free agency. So both of the guys have been around the block, right? But Max Scherzer, the veteran statesman, he was a leader when Trea Turner was coming up with the Washington Nationals, and now they're both veterans in their own right. And they got a chance to face off against each other in the first at-bat of the game in the Phillies' recent spring training action. Phillies a road team. They hit first. Scherzer the starter. Trea Turner was batting leadoff. And to set all of this up, if you have not seen the comments, Max Scherzer said last week on the ABS situation with the automatic balls and strikes being able to challenge that, his quote went, I don't want to say viral, but like people in baseball were talking about his quote, which was, why can't we just be judged by humans? He doesn't like the system. Now, Max Scherzer has not been known as a guy who likes a bunch of stuff. He'll complain about batters being out of the box too long. I imagine he doesn't love the review process, adding time to at-bats. I imagine the pitch clock was something he enjoyed very much because he just wants to get his work done and move on. Like, get in the box. I'm going to get you out. Let's get on to the next guy. Now, that plays a little bit differently later on in his career when his stuff isn't as good, but we know Max Scherzer is not an easygoing guy, and we know he's a guy that likes to work fast. So he complains about the system, and is just like, let humans judge other humans. Like, let umpires do it the way that it's always done. And he strikes me as a very old-fashioned type of guy, an old-fashioned pitcher. If you dropped Max Scherzer's temperament into like the 1920s, 30s, whatever, like he'd be just fine. He could pitch in any era of baseball with that mentality of just like the hard-nosed, I almost said reliever, hard-nosed pitcher. It goes after hitters with no abandon. So Trea Turner, being, of course, a friend of Max Scherzer, a teammate, a World Series champion along with Max Scherzer, that creates a bond, right? They weren't just like, oh, I had a cup of coffee in Washington. They won a World Series together. So these guys are boys. Like, they're tight. And Trea Turner is a guy, just like a lot of the Phillies in the locker room, that seems to be a good teammate, right? Seems to be a good locker room guy. The Phillies have compiled, for all of their postseason faults, they have compiled a bunch of dudes who are just good dudes. And that's something that we may take for granted. And it doesn't win you World Series necessarily, but it is nice to see. It's nice to be able to root for dudes in a clubhouse that are just like, they like each other. They're nice to each other. They're fun personalities to be around. They're guys you would like to grab a beer with. And Trea Turner is one of those guys. So what does he do to his old pal Max Scherzer? As soon as the first pitch is thrown, Max Scherzer fires a fastball that is, it's not middle, but it is in the meat of the zone, like a clear strike. And as the catcher's receiving the ball, Trea Turner already has his hand on his helmet, telling the umpire to challenge it. And it's a great moment that you only get in spring training, because you're not going to waste challenges on something dumb like that in the regular season. But in spring training, it doesn't matter. That Scherzer is going to get annoyed because he already complained about the challenge system. And on the first pitch, on a clear strike, Trea Turner's like, yeah, why don't you go take a look at that one, pal? And the umpire goes back and actually checks it. And Trea's just sitting there smirking at Max, his old teammate. And the best part about it is, as Max Scherzer is getting ready to deliver the next pitch, after the appeal was obviously ruled an unsuccessful challenge and the strike call was upheld, you could see Scherzer cracking a smile as well as he's getting ready to deliver a pitch, which is not something that, I got to be honest, I ever remember seeing or ever thought that I would see. That just doesn't compute with the way that Max Scherzer has existed in baseball over the last, decade plus. Like, he's just a guy that always takes his craft very seriously, especially when he's on the mound. Like, off the mound, maybe you'll get a grin from him every once in a while in like an interview, but in the moment, he's a psychopath on the mound. He's crazy. He's a scary person when he takes the mound to throw a baseball. And Trea Turner's got him laughing in spring training. And that's the fun thing about this stuff, is these little relationships that guys develop over time with former teammates or anything like that, former coaches, teams that they used to play for, where maybe they know the fan base, but they don't know many of the players. Whatever the case may be, baseball has a lot of intermingling, because there's a lot of time to stand around and chat. And there's a lot of movement between teams. And we got a all-time spring training moment from Trea Turner and Max Scherzer with that immediate challenge as the catcher receives the ball. It reminds me of like now not quite to this scale, because this one was egregious and people love to just jump on umpires. But the JT ejection a couple years back, was that last year or 2 years ago, when JT Realmuto was like reaching back for a ball from the umpire, and he moved his glove right as the umpire was going to put it in his glove unknowingly, and ends up, the ball just goes right to the ground, and the umpire ejects like a snap ejection. It's just, this is a reminder, right? The Trea Turner, Max Scherzer thing. If Max Scherzer is not taking spring training too seriously, you shouldn't either. So that's a good place to wrap up today's episode. Going back to any spring worries, Max Scherzer is smiling and chuckling on the mound, because Trea Turner, his old buddy, called a quick challenge on him to slow down the at-bat, because it'd be funny. Like, Trea Turner is wasting a challenge to go ahead and check something to mess with Max Scherzer. Guys are messing around left and right, just having a good time down there, getting ready for the season, taking care of their business. But no, if they're not overly worried about spring, you shouldn't be overly worried about spring performances by the offensive players. And also, you shouldn't be overly optimistic about Taijuan Walker's spring performance with the velocity going up. It's just a reminder, these games don't count. There are guys working on stuff. The stakes are not that high. So take everything this time of year with a grain of salt. And some of it will matter and some of it won't. It's very hard to tell at this time, but at least we're able to sit down and watch some Philadelphia Phillies baseball and start to break down what to focus on ahead of the regular season that could actually matter. That's my job, right? Sifting between, what you should be worried about and what you shouldn't be worried about. So hopefully I broke that down a little bit for you in today's episode. Tomorrow's episode, we're going to have the opening day roster prediction version 2.0. So we're going to run through that along with a couple other things. But again, that's all for today's episode of Locked On Phillies. Again, we're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Please make sure you're rating and reviewing and hitting that subscribe button on the Locked On Phillies YouTube channel. All that stuff really helps us out here on Locked On Phillies. And I'll talk to you tomorrow on the next episode of Locked On Phillies.